Thank you, Chair Sarah, for inviting me to speak today. As Sarah said, I come from DEC, which is a government department in the UK. The department's focused on demand and supply, and my role is really about reducing demand from householders. So I'm really referring to homes all the time when I talk about insulation. I don't have the greatest job title, head of insulation, but it is referring to insulating homes. I'm going to talk, to start with, a little bit about what are the drivers for the UK in actually pushing forward this policy, because I think those drivers are different to the drivers for households, and they may be different for the drivers for lots of other stakeholders that are involved. So I'll try and clarify why action is needed. There are actually too many slides on my slide pack for the time I have, so I'm going to brush past a few relatively quickly. But the key things I want to convey today are really what is current policy in the UK to drive insulation, and that comes under two main schemes, CERT and CESP, and I'll explain the acronyms later. And then I want to dedicate a bit of time to where we're going next, which is the new coalition government's Green Deal. It won't be launched for some time because of a legislative process we have to go through, but I want to talk about some of the concepts and the ways of working in that market, because some of those issues came up right at the beginning of today about finance, attaching to the meter, different types of ways of getting this market active and moving in a more dynamic way. And I'm going to come back to some of our ideas on that. But to start off with the science bit, essentially the UK signed up to a carbon budget to reduce by the 2020 midpoint of the carbon budget a 34% cut in greenhouse gas emissions, and going further to 2050 to reduce by 80%. For homes and communities, which is essentially households, we've estimated the contribution needs to be a 29% reduction by 2020 in their carbon emissions. And this is in the non-traded sector, which is a term you may see in some of my slides, which essentially means gas, so not electricity, which is already carbon priced. So essentially my job is about cutting people's gas consumption, or their need for gas, as it were. So all sectors will contribute. Just to cover some of the particular issues with the household side, the particular challenges. UK's got 26 million households. It's got a very old housing stock, different tenures with different issues, a good deal of private rented housing, social housing, but a dominant owner-occupied tenure. Around 2/3 of all housing is owner-occupied. The reality is, and I won't dwell on this because I think other slides are going to talk about public opinion, that there's relatively little appetite for change. It's clearly rational to do some of the basic measures of insulation because they pay back very quickly, but people either aren't aware of what they should do, or even if they are aware, it feels like too much hassle, or it's not worth bothering with. There are no positive feedback side. It's not like somebody's made the point earlier about how people will think very carefully or put a lot of thought into getting a new kitchen. The reality is that some of the things we're talking about don't attract the same positive feel for people, but maybe that's something for other discussions. So it's a difficult challenge. What we can say from this graph is that the contribution of households in terms of carbon emissions hasn't come down significantly since 1990. This is relatively lagged data. But the reality is that it's quite a static graph, and it isn't improving quickly. So we do need some radical change, and I'll come on to that with the coalition government. But just skip past that one. So, as I say, I think because people aren't naturally going to buy insulation, there is a role for government because it impacts on government in terms of energy security, the carbon targets that we've talked about, but we also think it's good for people in cutting their energy bills. This snazzy little diagram of a house shows some of the housing tenures, some of the technologies that we try to incentivise, but on the right-hand side, there's a list of current and developing policy. I won't go through all of those, but I am going to come on to explain the carbon emissions reduction target and the community energy savings programme. And I'm also going to talk about Green Deal. I know that earlier today there was discussion of some of our microgen programmes in the UK. I don't lead on those, but I'm happy to put anyone in touch if they want to understand how those are developing. At the moment, we only have the feed-in tariff for electricity generation. There's still a lot of thought about the renewable heat incentive, and we're in a spending review which might be very tough in terms of how we can take that forward, but it's still an ambition of this government to incentivise heat generations, air source and ground source heat pumps. I'll pass by this. This one here is essentially taking all of those policies and actually defining what carbon they will contribute by 2020, carbon reduction they'll contribute. And at the bottom, to cut a long story short, they suggest that there is an absence of policy to achieve about 4 megatonne per year reduction. Okay, I'm going to focus on CERT, Carbon Emissions Reduction Target, for a while. This is our lead current policy. It has been around for about 8 years in various guises. It's a regulation, basically. It requires or obligates energy suppliers. You'll see here it says the suppliers with over 50,000 domestic customers. That actually cuts it right down to the 6 biggest companies, which are way bigger than that anyway. They've set a carbon reduction goal, which is proportionate to the number of customers they have. Failure to meet that goal comes with quite a stark penalty, 10% of global turnover if they fail to meet that goal. In the years that we've had of different settings, i.e. carbon goals for a year, 3 years, they've never failed to achieve it, which you can probably see why. What they're given to achieve the goal is a list of agreed measures that they can install in people's homes. The measures come with a carbon score, which is the lifetime savings of that installation. But apart from that, we leave it very open. They can pay others to deliver on their behalf. They can deliver in partnership. They can do any of the items they like, but I will come on to how we might be clamping down on that. The money for this, and it is a considerable amount of money, essentially comes off people's energy bills. We estimate about £50 a year on gas and electric bills because of the CERT programme. Now that creates some sort of equity issues in that everyone who gets gas and electric is paying towards this, but not everyone receives in any one year. But that is one of the downsides of such a scheme. When I come on to the Green Deal, I think it'd be a lot clearer that the beneficiary is the one who is paying back, but we'll come on to that. Okay, I won't dwell on this one other than to sort of give you a sense of the scale. The supplier obligations, EEC, which was before CERT, don't ask me why, and CERT from April 2008 have basically insulated 9 million homes, and the amounts invested in this are estimated. We don't ask for specific information from the energy companies. We don't specify what they have to spend. That is a regulation. If it was a tax and spend measure, which is something our Treasury are looking at, we probably would get into some of that detail, but we don't at the moment. One of the points you might see on there, which is an issue of a little bit of embarrassment in the UK, is 300 million CFLs distributed, compact fluorescent light bulbs. They were one of the measures that was allowable under CERT. They do reduce carbon, but this is one of the dangers of a scheme like this, that if you are not very careful about the way it's managed, the energy companies can play the system, send this out en masse. People have got hundreds of these light bulbs in their homes on the shelf, and they're not cutting carbon because there's no real additionality of those items. So these are the things we've got to watch for very carefully in how we both have an open system that has flexibility, but we do actually achieve real carbon saving. Just to give you a quick sense, CERT was extended or will be extended from April 2011. I'm just going to talk about a few things that will change between April 2011 and the end of CERT, which is definitely the end of CERT, end of 2012. First of all, CFLs. You can't use CFLs at all to gain a carbon score. So light bulbs like that are out. We do require under CERT that 40% of delivery goes to what we specify as a priority group, and they are what you might term very broadly as fuel-poor households and older households. What we've realised through the first iterations of CERT is that even within a priority group, there's much easier priority group households to pick off, if you like, and that leads to distributional issues, which means that the scheme may not always be fair. It may always tend to skew to those households that are easier to get at. So what we're going to do is create a super priority group within the priority group, which is a more tightly defined, most deprived group, and they will be required to achieve a certain percentage on that group as well. Part of our bargain in doing that is actually to provide them with the data to be able to know who these people are and where to go to. And one of the other things you'll see from this is we're actually going to require a insulation minimum. So we think insulation is such a clear value for money part of the CERT scheme that we are ensuring that it is delivered to a certain percentage of all CERT delivery, 68%. I'd have liked 70%, but that's the negotiation you have within government sometimes. And above that, we do have DIY loft insulation, and that is sometimes an area for argument as to whether we know that loft insulation goes into homes once it leaves DIY shops. I think the jury's out on that, but we do also incentivise buying lagging from DIY chains. Okay, I'll skip past that. I'm going to move now to a scheme called CESP, which is the sort of small child of CERT. It's relatively small, but it's still reasonably significant. 350 million likely to be invested over 3 years, reaching about 90,000 households, and we expect the energy companies to deliver about 100 projects, roughly. But it's really, again, the carbon which they have to achieve, and that's what's specified for them. The nuance that CESP has that takes it beyond CERT is they have to achieve those carbon savings within relatively small numbers of defined areas, and those areas are defined by being the most deprived parts of the UK. We have an index of multiple deprivation, and they have to deliver within those areas and achieve those carbon scores. So essentially, and this was devised by the previous administration, essentially we're trying to squeeze together activity. CERT can often be picking off low-hanging fruit right across the country, those people that are willing to do it with a small subsidy. What we're really pushing within the CESP areas is grouped activity, doing streets, doing tower blocks, doing some of the more difficult measures like exterior solid wall insulation. And the scores reflect that. So if you do not only a house and get a score for that, but do a row of houses, there's an enhancement to your score, and that's the way it works. It's driving activity at a local level. There's still flexibility as to how they organise that activity. So they can work with the local authority, which is preferable in lots of cases, but they can work with what we used to term the third sector. I haven't caught up with a new name, but they can work with a range of different bodies that are good at reaching out to communities and saying, these people can be trusted, it's good for you, it'll save money on your bills, etc. And I should have said before that the priority group in most circumstances get almost a full subsidy to ensure that they do install. And again, that's subsidised by the energy company, and that comes through to our energy bills. Just a very quick illustration of how CESP is spread at the moment. 19 live schemes. I think there's about, it says 60. Such is the pace it's picking up. It's now 80 in the pipeline. We do need to evaluate it, although, with a change in government, you can often feel like anything that happened in the past is somehow obsolete, but I think we're quite keen to learn some of these issues about street by street, about community involvement, about cost savings at scale. One of the things that I will touch on at some point is what we see as the real change in the next decade, and that is the amount of solid wall insulation that we'll have to do. Essentially, in the UK, because of the amount of loft and cavity wall insulation that's been done, we're likely to run out by about 2015, 2016. All practical lofts and cavities will have been done. But that won't achieve our carbon goal by 2020. So the next place to look is for solid wall housing. And we estimate under some calculations that could mean as much as 2 million solid walls by 2020, which is obviously a huge step if you consider that we're doing about 20,000 a year at the moment. So it's a massive jump in solid wall. And that's where the future's going, and that's why CESP is important, because it shows where solid wall can be delivered at scale. And it shows the price comes down significantly. So we often talk about £10,000, which is probably current exchange rate, the same in euros. Talk about that much for a decent-sized property to do exterior solid wall. Some of our examples from CESP show that you not only halve that, but you can halve it again if you can do it at scale. So we need to understand scale issues and cost. Okay, I want to come on to Green Deal, which really is where we're going. You probably all know that we had a change of government in May. After a bit of messing about, a coalition was agreed. The Conservatives, in their manifesto, had the Green Deal, which was an approach that I'm going to talk about. But we don't follow slavishly that approach because it is a liberal, conservative coalition, and we have been adjusting it as we've developed it. It really brings two things with it, the Green Deal. One is a recognition that the market for home energy efficiency at the moment is actually still pretty weak. It needs to be propped up by regulation. It needs government to keep pushing it, and householders aren't really engaged. It also recognises that we have to move on to the more significant measures. So the solid wall that I talked about is just one example. Heating controls. There will be others, and I'll come on to the types of installations that may be relevant. The diagram on the bottom is a very simplified version of what the Green Deal process looks like. The key thing that makes it innovative is that finance will be attached to the meter of a property. So the offer is likely to be that there's no upfront cost for any installation, but the payback is over a time period and it's taken out of your meter payments, which should be less than the cost of fuel that you would have paid without doing those measures. I'll go through some of those steps over the next slides. I won't dwell on them too much because I've got relatively short time, but the start of the process will be an assessment within the home of the measures that can be done to that property. It's property specific, and it will be looking at typical energy use and whether those measures over time would pay for themselves and are therefore relevant for the Green Deal. So if you can do a loft or cavity wall insulation and it pays for itself, that will be indicated in our assessment. You can then shop around once you know those measures that are possible, and you can go to providers and they'll quote you on doing the work. So that's the first stage. It's quite likely it will be a form of the current energy performance certificate, but it will need to be adapted to fulfil the role of a Green Deal. Okay, turning to finance. So, as I said, the householder receives measures at no upfront cost from the Green Deal provider. The obligation is on the energy company to process a payment via the meter. It doesn't have to be the energy company that does the measure. They just have to make sure that it comes from the bill payer through to the person that's actually holding the finance or taking back the finance. Some of the discussion this morning touched on, the interest of pension companies and the interest of banks and investors. We've had lots of those discussions in the UK about who would be interested, and I think initially this is likely to be bankrolled by those companies that want to get in first with Green Deal, but we think over time, once the amount builds up, these requirements, if you like, can be bundled and securitized on the investment markets, and there's definitely interest there, and that again does relate to things like pension funds, where they're interested in the long-term secure flow of funding, even if it's not exceptional growth or exceptional profit. The key thing about the finance is it stays when someone moves home. So the problem we had before was that if you wanted to do something reasonably significant like solid wall, and then you do what most people do on average, move house, every 10 years, you wouldn't have gained the full benefit of that measure for the time you've been there. And it's unlikely that the house value would reflect your investment either. That's another area we're working on. So that's one of the key things about it. The requirement stays with the property, it doesn't move with the person. There's no forcing to pay off. There is no loan sitting on the property. It cannot be paid off like that. Otherwise, I think at the conveyancing process, when someone buys that house, they just say, well, get rid of that debt on the property. There is no debt on the property. It's just a requirement on the energy company to keep taking the payment to feed across to pay the finance. I won't say too much on this because I think we're all aware of the need for consistent standards, and other speakers today have raised that we really do recognise that. But we do see it under the Green Deal banner as being one of the key things that gives people trust that people are doing things that are accredited. They will save them, whether it's carbon or heating cost. They are the right products, they're done by the right people, there is spot checking. It's going to be a tighter process than we have at the moment. But I think that's one of the things that I see as key to this is CERT has been almost an invisible policy in many ways. energy companies in the UK are offering insulation deals, but it's just their offer. And I think there's potential for the consumer to be quite confused by that, because there's been a few people today say, well, energy services are the future, and I think some of our energy companies would agree with that. But at the moment, I don't think it's very clear why they're pushing insulation on people, why they're incentivising it. It's all in the background. What is likely to be the case in the future is that Green Deal will be a stamp on private sector activity that shows that they are accredited, that they are doing it with the backing of government, that this does all lead back to a central sort of hypothesis about carbon saving and energy security. I'm not sure I've got time to do this one justice, so I'll skip over it. Just to go through the indicative timetable, essentially Green Deal proper, with that legislative underpinning that ties the payment to the meter, will not be possible until autumn 2012. And that is when CERT will finish. And then we'll move on to the Green Deal. What it does mean, and this is one of the key aspects of it though, is that those able to pay are much more likely to have that repayment themselves and to pay the full amount. Under CERT, we've all been paying under our energy bills, and we've all been subsidising lots of people that are able to pay, as well as the fuel poor. I know questions come later, but I'm certainly happy for anyone to contact me on the details of what I've pretty much rushed through, but I hope I can work with people around this room just to give you a clearer understanding of what we have done in the past and what we're trying to do in the future. Thank you very much.